America, a new report just landed in Washington, and it confirms what President Trump has been saying for years. Europe, the birthplace of Western civilization, is in deep trouble. According to the US strategic assessment, the continent faces what the authors call a civilizational eraser. Economies faltering, borders open, population shrinking. The warning is stark. For years, Trump sounded the alarm. Europe was weakening, relying on green energy schemes, open borders, and pacifist policies that left it vulnerable. Today, the evidence is on the table, and it can't be ignored. This isn't just policy talk. This is a wake-up call for the West, a moment when decades of warning finally meet undeniable proof. If you care about national security, the future of Western civilization, and the lessons of leadership that actually work, you need to watch this entire video, because what you're about to hear isn't just analysis. It's the moment Trump's foresight meets reality. Smash the like button, subscribe, and stay with me, because today we're laying out why the West is at a crossroads and why ignoring this report could cost more than Europe realizes. Europe is on the edge of a crisis most Americans barely notice. Radical green energy mandates, collapsing birth rates, and open borders have left the continent vulnerable in every sense, economically, demographically, and militarily. Picture this: streets of Europe filled with populations that are aging faster than they can replace themselves. Fertility rates at 1.39, far below what's needed to sustain a nation. Millions of new arrivals from the Middle East, many arriving illegally, struggling to integrate, while social tension simmers just beneath the surface. Economically, the EU has fallen from global powerhouse to a shadow of its former self. Its share of world GDP has plummeted in just 20 years, leaving it weaker, slower, and less competitive. Militarily, most nations fail to meet NATO's 2% spending requirement, leaving borders exposed and defenses thin, vulnerable to the Russian juggernaut moving across Ukraine. The US report doesn't point fingers, it extends a hand. We are your equals. We are your brothers. Partner with us. Get back in the game. But instead of gratitude, European leaders erupted with anger. Pride, politics, and decades of mismanaged policy collided, turning advice into offense. Here's the truth. Their fury isn't about ego alone. It's about reality hitting them where it hurts. America, the upstart offspring of European civilization, is now stronger, more self-reliant, and prepared for the global challenges Europe has ignored. And that's where the tension rises. If Europe refuses to face its own failures, can the West survive rising threats from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea? The clock is ticking and the stage is set. Europe's choices over the next decade may decide the fate of the Western world, and America may be forced to pick up the pieces. Now the tension sharpens, because what the United States warned about isn't abstract theory. It's a deepening divide between American realism and European complacency, and it's playing out right now on the world stage. The Trump administration's new strategic assessment didn't just describe Europe's challenges, it called them out by name and tied them directly to policies European elites have embraced for decades. And when the president speaks, he doesn't mince words. In recent interviews, Donald Trump has described Europe as decaying and its leadership as weak and politically correct to a fault. A blunt judgment rooted in his belief that unchecked migration, cultural relativism, and soft power politics have hollowed out Europe's strength. This isn't partisan rhetoric. It's a strategic assessment that reflects a worldview rooted in American patriotism, national self-interest, and defense of Western civilization. Trump is effectively saying Europe is not just declining economically, it's weakening its cultural and defense foundations, and that threatens the West as a whole. He's also been clear about NATO, the cornerstone of transatlantic security. Trump has repeatedly pointed out that Europe isn't pulling its weight financially or militarily, and that the United States shouldn't shoulder burdens others refuse to share, as he put it in a recent policy conversation. I'm going to try and help Ukraine, but Europe has to get there also and do their job. They're not doing their job. We are in for so much more than the European nations. That's a high-stakes message that cuts to the core of American patriot thinking. We defend freedom, but we should not pay for the defense of others who refuse to defend themselves. And this isn't theoretical. Europe's military spending speaks for itself. Even now, decades after NATO's founding, many European capitals still fail to meet the alliance's own 2% GDP defense guideline, the bare minimum agreed to at past summits. Trump's critics say his language is harsh, but from a worldview rooted in American strength, clarity, and realism, that language is intentional. Trump isn't just critiquing, he's forcing a reckoning. If Europe won't defend its people, culture, and borders, if it won't invest in its own security, then how can it stand as a partner of the United States? That's the argument driving European anger. And it's also why the US strategic report triggered such fury abroad. It wasn't a diplomatic sugarcoating. It was a mirror held up to Europe's leadership, showing them that political correctness, green utopianism, and open borders can't compete with the hard realities of global power. Imagine the scene. A continent that once led the world, now facing its own decline. And an American president telling allies bluntly that words aren't enough without strength, sovereignty, and shared responsibility. To many Europeans, that stings. But to millions of Americans watching this unfold, especially patriots who believe in national sovereignty, shared defense, and cultural continuity, Trump's message resonates as a clarion call for Western resurgence, not retreat. Now, the story takes an even sharper turn. Because Europe isn't just struggling, it's responding with hostility to the very assessment that is meant to save it. And at the heart of this tension is President Donald J. Trump's unapologetically blunt critique of European leadership, underscoring a fundamental divide in how America and Europe see the future of the West. In a recent interview with Politico, Trump didn't mince words. He described many European governments as decaying and weak, specifically pointing to their immigration policies and NATO performance as evidence of that weakness. He said that the drive for political correctness makes their leaders unable to act, calling their current approach a disaster that undermines the continent's stability. Trump didn't stop there. He rejected Europe's inertia on the Ukraine war, saying, "They talk, but they don't produce." A cutting indictment of leadership that prefers rhetoric to decisive action. He warned that many European countries risk losing their viability if they continue down their current path. In every line, he hammered home a simple, dramatic thesis. Europe's refusal to confront its deepest structural weaknesses isn't just a policy mistake, it's a strategic vulnerability that threatens all of Western civilization. And that's where the contrast becomes stark and emotional for the American viewer. On one side, you have Trump's America First worldview, unapologetically patriotic, rooted in strength, self-interest, and clarity about who America's true adversaries are. His leadership insists that allies must pull their own weight, especially when facing existential threats from Russia, China, Iran, and other authoritarian powers. On the other side, many European politicians, more concerned with globalist ideology than national resilience, respond not with substantive reform, but with crying outrage and indignation at being criticized by their oldest ally. European leaders have publicly rejected Trump's language as interference in their domestic affairs, even as Russia and other adversaries cheer from the sidelines. But listen to Trump's logic here, because this is where the stakes become moral and strategic. He's not simply attacking Europe for sport. He's issuing a warning that Western civilization cannot survive if its leaders prioritize political correctness over common sense, ideological purity over cultural continuity, and performative unity over real strength. Trump's critics call his language harsh, but patriots see something else. A leader refusing to sugarcoat reality when the future of freedom itself is at stake. This contrast between American realism and European utopian complacency is not just geopolitical, it's a drama about values. America fights for strength and sovereignty. Europe clings to ideology and avoidance, and the world watches to see which model prevails. Right now, Trump's strategic critique is creating not just diplomatic tension, it's forcing a choice. Will the West double down on principles that preserve freedom, security, and national identity? Or will it retreat into policies that weaken its own foundations while inviting rivals to fill the vacuum? The answer to that question, and where Europe ultimately lands, will define the global balance of power for generations. And every American watching this unfold should understand why this matters here at home. Because the same debates about energy policy, immigration, sovereignty, and cultural identity that Europe refuses to solve are playing out in the United States too, just on our terms and at our pace. America may be warning Europe, but the lesson echoes back across the Atlantic. Strength doesn't come from avoiding hard truths. It comes from facing them. And when leaders will not, citizens must. What explains the fury from European capitals? At heart, this is not merely a clash over geopolitics. It is a crisis of identity, strategic purpose, and moral authority between Washington and its oldest allies. The United States, heirs to European political traditions and self-government, is delivering a message steeped in realism and strategic clarity. Europe, in response, hears it as condescension and threat. From a political science perspective, this dynamic stems from asymmetric interdependence. Europe relies on the US for hard security and strategic deterrence, yet increasingly rejects the domestic values and policy prescriptions that undergird American power and cohesion. This contradiction is at the center of the recent backlash. President Trump's critique that many European nations have become decaying and weak because of unchecked migration, political correctness, and indecisive leadership is rooted in an analytical assessment of structural imbalances within European society and governance. In a Politico interview, Trump explicitly called European immigration policies a disaster and labeled Europe's leaders as unable to act decisively in the face of existential pressures, including Russia's aggression and demographic decline. From a strategic standpoint, the US message is not ideological posturing. It is anchored in realpolitik. States that fail to marshal coherent identity, defend secure borders, and invest adequately in defense will not be reliable partners in a multipolar world dominated by strategic competition with China and resurgent authoritarian powers. Europe's failure to meet NATO's own 2% defense guideline, decades after it was agreed, exemplifies this mismatch between rhetoric and responsibility. Historically, a polity's ability to project power and preserve order has always depended on burden sharing and institutional coherence, from the Roman Republic's legions to Cold War NATO deterrence. Europe's current trajectory, in contrast, resembles moments of strategic exhaustion seen in past great powers that failed to adapt to systemic pressures. But why the visceral European backlash? Here, political psychology intersects with history. Europe's elites view American critique as an attack from an upstart former colony, a narrative rooted in centuries of transatlantic evolution rather than direct strategic dispute. This perception amplifies resentment because it touches on symbolic prestige as much as policy substance. Europe's leaders have pursued utopian social policies, aggressive green targets, permissive migration frameworks, extensive regulatory regimes, not in spite of their consequences, but because these reflect an ideological commitment to cosmopolitan governance. Confronting these policies, therefore, feels like confronting the very project of European identity that has defined its post-war order. Victor Davis Hanson's one-eyed Jack metaphor captures this tension succinctly. Europe presents one face when it needs American military protection and another when it rejects American cultural and political lessons. On one side, as NATO allies, European states affirm their need for US leadership against Russia and other threats. On the other side, as proponents of EU globalist and progressive policies, they reflexively reject the very values, free speech, individual rights, secure borders, that have underwritten Western strength since the Enlightenment. Strategically, this creates a double standard that undermines alliance cohesion. From the US point of view, it is irrational for Europe to demand American security guarantees while pursuing policies that weaken internal resilience and societal cohesion. From Europe's point of view, American critique feels like external interference, not merely in defense arrangements, but in the cultural and political self-definition of sovereign states. This clash is not new. It echoes the historical tensions between imperial centers and rising powers. But unlike the Cold War, when US-European cooperation was fueled by a shared existential threat, today the alliance finds itself without a clearly articulated, mutually accepted strategic framework for confronting emerging rivals. The consequences of this divergence are profound. At a time when global power is shifting rapidly, with China's strategic assertiveness, Russia's continued aggression, and the erosion of liberal democratic norms, the West cannot afford strategic incoherence among its leading democracies. Europe's ambivalence weakens deterrence, undermines shared defense, and signals to adversaries that Western solidarity is fraying. In contrast, the US approach, centered on measured but unapologetic criticism, seeks to catalyze self-corrective reform within European states rather than alienate them entirely. Whether Europe responds with integration and resilience or retreats into ideological defensiveness will help define the future of Western alliances. In sum, the backlash against Washington's blunt assessment is not simply emotional. It is a strategic contest over the values and policies that will determine whether the Western project endures or falters. The United States warns against complacency because history shows that great powers in decline rarely recover without confronting uncomfortable truths about identity, governance, and national purpose. Europe's current reaction reveals not just political discord, but a deeper crisis of strategic self-understanding. One that both American policymakers and patriots must watch closely. Here's the truth every American patriot needs to hear. The West is at a crossroads. For decades, both Europe and the US have experimented with policies: radical green energy, open borders, extreme DEI, pacifism, that have weakened our economic and military strength. They sound good on paper, but in reality, they make us vulnerable. They erode resilience. They threaten our very way of life. America is saying, we are confronting these challenges. We are dealing with reality. Europe, pay attention. Listen to the dissident voices. Stop playing a double standard. We share common enemies. China, Iran, North Korea, Russia. Partnership matters more than pretense. This is more than politics. This is a moral, patriotic call. The survival of Western civilization is not guaranteed. Europe must reconcile ideology with reality, or watch their economies, their militaries, their culture decline, and America must stand firm, leading, protecting, and guiding, but never compromising on the values that built this nation. This is a turning point, a defining moment, a chance for America to hold the line for liberty, for strength, for civilization itself. For patriots, conservatives, and every citizen who believes in the American experiment, the message is simple: stay vigilant, demand accountability, defend our principles. America must lead, and we must ensure that leadership reflects the values that make our nation exceptional. Because if we falter now, the consequences will echo far beyond borders. This isn't just Europe's problem. It's a warning for every free nation that liberty, prosperity, and security are never guaranteed. They must be earned, defended, and passed to the next generation. And patriots, it starts with us, holding leaders accountable, protecting our culture, securing our borders, investing in strength, and reminding the world that America will never bow to ideological convenience. This is the call, the wake-up, the turning point. History is watching, and the West's future depends on what we do next. If you want to see the full story behind Europe's decline, America's leadership, and the high-stakes battles shaping our future, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay with us, because every policy, every decision, and every moment of inaction matters. The choices made today won't just shape Europe, They will determine the future of America and the Western world. Don't miss what comes next.